Hello, everyone. Welcome to another week of instructional design. In module 4, I'm going to talk about instructional strategies for active learning. But as you can see, I am going to focus on problem based learning. There are other instructional strategies for active learning, but this is what resonates with me as a constructivist scholar. These are the contents for today's presentation. What is problem based learning? This is where I'm going to explain. And not just explain, I'm going to also present about the historical development, the big names behind this history, theoretical basis, and then key principles or steps. In the analysis stage, this is where I try to analyze the strengths and the weaknesses of problem based learning, conditions for implementation, and the role of technology. Because this is an educational technology course, we want to understand its role, technology's role in problem based learning. And then the third point, which is examples, this is where I provide or I present about the high profile exemplary implementations of problem based learning, best practices found in the literature, and then findings from research studies. Of course, as we always do it, I conclude with some key takeaways. So, what is problem based learning? This is a subject that started in the 1980s. Of course, the word was coined somewhere around the 1960s, thereabout. Barrows and Tamblyn wrote a paper in the medical field about problem based learning. So, what is problem based learning? So, it is an instructional strategy where learners start with a complex, meaningful problem, and learners collaboratively define what they need to know, pursue directed learning, and then apply and reflect on their learning in order to propose and justify solutions. And as you can see, I have cited four authoritative figures when it comes to problem based learning. And you can follow along or you can read about them. So, what is the historical development of problem based learning? So, problem based learning is widely traced to medical education, like I said, especially the work of Barrows and Tamblyn. They are the face of problem based learning. They started it in a medical education setting. And after that, we have scholars like Kilpatrick, and he would argue that, okay, so they wrote their paper in 1980, but Kilpatrick tried to write something about problem based learning and Dewey as well, but they didn't use the exact words. However, they were of the view that learning should be through meaningful activity and experience, and that is what problem based learning is about. So they did not specifically coin the term, which was a later coined by Barrows and Tamblyn, but there was that kind of idea before. So, what is the theoretical basis? Of course, in social sciences and any other, whether the natural sciences, there's always a paradigm where scholars want to work within. So, what theory or theoretical framework is being backed by problem based learning? Of course, constructivist learning. So, this is where we view learning as, students understanding depends on context, and activity, learning is situated by some kind of puzzlement and problematic situations, right? And when it comes to situated learning, as the name implies, this is where the social piece come in. We want to be able to create some kind of an environment which aligns with social cultural perspective. So there's that kind of creating a context for students to work within in order to understand the problem. And cognitive apprenticeship. So here the facilitator models and coaches thinking, then gradually fades scaffolds as learners gain expertise. And then social cultural perspective, which is just like constructivist learning. So in the cognitive psychology literature, there are scholars who raise the banner of Piaget's constructivist learning. Others also raise the banner of von Glisserfield or Lev Vygotsky. So, however you want to term it, whether constructivist learning or social cultural perspectives, they all emphasize that knowledge should be built through engaging in authentic inquiry and problem solving, not just receiving information. So, what are the core componential elements or key principles? Of course, this was adapted from the very another authoritative text by Silver, 2004, and the title of their book is Problem Based Learning: What and How Do Students Learn? So these were the components or the compositions that I synthesized from the book. So the first one is problem. Of course, problem based learning. We should have a problem, and this problem should be complex and not too complex enough that students would not be able to crack the nut. And small group collaboration. So students come together and share ideas, and then self directed learning. So there is that kind of intrinsic motivation where students drive their own learning. The fourth component is facilitation. If you recall from the previous module, we talked about understand by design framework. And at the heart of this framework is the role of the teacher. And the role of the teacher is not a sage on the stage, rather, the teacher should be a facilitator and a coach. And then the last point is reflection for transfer. Again, in the previous module, we realized that transfer is the higher order understanding. If a student is able to transfer what they have learned to different contexts, then we can say they have really understood. So this is the stage that students reflect, and through that they'll be able to transfer. The next slide, I'm going to talk about the analysis. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of problem-based learning? So one of the strengths is that active learning and deeper understanding and retention. Because of the constructivist piece in the problem based learning, where we want students to be able to construct their own knowledge, there's that kind of activeness. Like students are very active, right? They are not just passive, they are directing their own learning, right? So whenever students do that, that is where they come across complex, challenges. And you know how students learn or how children learn? First, we hit a block and we are not able to assimilate new understanding to our schemas. So what we do is that we go through some kind of perturbations or cognitive dissonance, and then we go back and forth until we can now assimilate the new knowledge into our schemas, and this is where understanding stems from. The second one is develops transferable competences. So, because you're not just memorizing facts, you are learning in context, you are able to transfer. The third strength is motivation. A teacher presents the problem, and students are so eager. Okay, I want to crack the nut, I want to solve the puzzle. So, students go through back and forth. They are just amazed as to how they'll be able to do it. So this is not extrinsic motivation where the teacher will be on students. Okay, if you do this, I'm gonna award you marks or something. But rather, the students are they take responsibility of their own learning. And then the last one is that it supports integration across topics. This is just like the second point. So here, students are able to connect ideas across domains instead of treating knowledge as isolated subject chunks. And remember, Wiggins and McTighe's Understand by Framework, they also talked about how students should be able to integrate across topics. What are the weaknesses of problem based learning? Facilitation demands are high. So, here instructors may struggle when they can't teach in traditional ways. So facilitation skill is essential. When should the teacher step in to provide help to students and when not to step in? And as I said, students learn best when they go through cognitive dissonances. And the second is resource intensive. It requires time, staffing, support, and access to information. You need a lot of information. The third one is information overload and uncertainty. Learners may not know what is relevant. Of course, some problems may just drive student off because they might not know where to start. So there's some kind of that overload. And then the fourth one is if assessment is mainly factual recall, then problem based learning strengths may not show. So, what I'm trying to mean here is that we want to be, we want problem based learning to stand out. So, just like thinking like an assessor in Understand by Design framework, here we don't just want students to provide, if that is the goal, like students provide correct answers. The answer is one, the answer is two. No. If that is the case, then what's the point of problem based learning? So, we should be, one of the weaknesses is that if the goal is just to assess factual recall and stuff like that, then there's no need. And these are the conditions for implementation. So, of course, high quality problems. If the problem is not high quality, there is not going to be that kind of cognitive perturbations. And as such, there's not going to be any reconstruction of mental schemas. There should be clear learning objectives. Again, I'm tying this slide back to Understand by Design framework. Objectives need to be stated clearly. Scaffolding and structure. So, here, learner readiness matters. Younger or less experienced learners may need more structure and support for self directed learning. And then aligned assessment, just like I said in the previous slide, we should make sure in order for problem based learning to work, there is the need to include a component of transferability. Students should be able to transfer whatever they are learning to new topics and new context. So, what is the role of technology or media in implementing problem based learning? So, technology can really, we all know that it can really enhance problem based learning, but it has to support the method, right? Not just to replace it. So, the first one we talk about support problem representation and reasoning. So, we have tools. We talked about digital tools for assessment in our previous module, and there are other platforms that help in problem representation and reasoning. The next one is externalized thinking and collaboration. There was a paper that I read where the scholars were talking about whiteboards. So students are able to use whiteboards and smart boards to really externalize their thinking. So they think aloud, write their thoughts on the whiteboard, and smart boards are also technological tools. The third one is enable multimedia cases. So when visual or audio cues are essential to problem solving, and lastly, foster online forums and service. So when social presence is not ideal, for example, in the era of COVID, that was very important. Examples. So, high profile exemplary context. Here we have distributed online problem based learning in medical education. So, in South Illinois University School of Medicine, remember I mentioned this scholar's name, Barrows, right? So, this is a flagship example of taking the classic medical school problem based learning module and implementing it in an online or distributive collaborative environment. So that is also a high profile exemplary context. The other one is University of Delaware's web-based problem-based learning support system. So the authors of the book argued that in order to support problem-based learning implementation at the University of Delaware, a web-based technology system was used to help instructors organize courses and then facilitate electronic communication. The fourth one, that is virtual or computer based problem based learning. So here, the computer supported problem based learning literature includes examples where interactive media, hypermedia is used to present problems and support inquiry. And lastly, online problem based across disciplines and beyond medicine. So the same review of the text that I mentioned earlier also notes that online or distributed problem based curricula have been implemented in areas such as social, economy, education, and science, reflecting broader adoption beyond clinical teach training. Best practices. So, the best practices that have been reported in the literature is that problem based learning builds reflection into the process. So, the best practice is that it builds reflection into the process and then design problems carefully, use collaboration support. And these were the findings from research studies. Problem based learning is linked with active learning, retention, and lifelong learning skill development. Problem based learning can generate a more stimulating learning environment, and outcome interpretation depends heavily on assessment type. Again, I explained that in the previous slide how assessment is very important in problem based learning. And these are the key takeaways. Problem based learning is problem first, and learning is driven by inquiry, not by front loaded teaching. Problem based learning impacts depends on implementation quality, especially problem design, facilitation, and alignment to assessment. And lastly, technology strengthens problem based learning when it supports the process. So, the process includes collaboration, scaffolding, authentic cases, and not just tools. And these are my references in case you would want to read more about the papers that I used in this presentation. And let me know if you have any comments. And yeah, thank you.